Ladies and gentlemen, imagine for a moment a man who has spent his entire life constructing a fortress around his heart, brick by brick, layer upon layer. He has built this edifice out of arrogance, out of self-deception, out of the desperate belief that he must be invulnerable to the world. And yet deep inside, beneath that hardened exterior, there is suffering, deep, profound suffering. Narcissism, at its core, is built upon a grand illusion, the illusion of self-sufficiency. It is the deeply ingrained belief that one is complete unto oneself, that one does not need others in any profound or meaningful way, and most tragically, that one does not need God. This illusion is seductive. It offers a sense of power, a feeling of superiority, and above all, a refuge from vulnerability. But beneath it lies an emptiness that grows more insatiable with time. A narcissistic individual often constructs a self-image that is meticulously designed to appear flawless. This image serves as a protective barrier against criticism, rejection, and, most importantly, self-reflection. The narcissist does not simply believe he is independent, he must believe it, because to do otherwise would mean confronting something terrifying, his own inadequacy. He cannot allow himself to admit weakness, for in his mind, weakness is synonymous with worthlessness. He cannot permit himself to rely on others in any deep emotional capacity because reliance implies dependence, and dependence implies a lack of control. This need for control is paramount. The narcissist must dictate the terms of his interactions, his relationships, and his perception of reality itself. If something threatens to expose the cracks in his carefully curated persona, he will either dismiss it outright, attack it with defensiveness, or twist it in such a way that it conforms to his pre-existing narrative. No, he cannot afford to be wrong, not truly, because to be wrong would mean admitting fallibility, and fallibility is the very thing he has spent his entire life outrunning. The danger of this mindset is that it is deeply self-perpetuating. The more the narcissist insists on his self-sufficiency, the more he isolates himself from the very things that could heal him. Genuine relationships, honest self-reflection, and most importantly, a connection to God. He convinces himself that he is strong, yet he is terrified of true introspection. He believes he is independent, yet he constantly seeks admiration and validation from others to sustain his fragile self-image. He claims he has everything under control, yet his life is often plagued by broken relationships, inner turmoil, and an underlying sense of dissatisfaction. What makes this illusion so dangerous is that it feels real. The narcissist may achieve success. He may attain wealth, power, admiration. He may be surrounded by people who affirm his self-image, either out of fear, obligation, or because they too are trapped in their own illusions. From the outside, he may appear to have everything one could desire. But no matter how much he accumulates, no matter how much praise he receives, it is never enough. The hunger for more recognition, more status, more control, never ceases. It cannot be satisfied because the very foundation upon which his identity is built is unstable. It is not rooted in anything real, anything eternal. It is built upon shifting sands. The human soul was not designed for self-worship. It was not meant to exist in isolation, detached from a higher purpose. The narcissist may try to convince himself that he is his own God, that he determines his own worth, that he alone is the architect of his destiny. But the truth is that no man is truly self-sufficient. No man can fill the void within himself through sheer force of will. No man can sustain himself on his own ego indefinitely. Eventually, reality catches up. The cracks in the illusion grow wider. The moments of triumph feel increasingly hollow. The relationships that once seemed manageable begin to crumble under the weight of his need for dominance. The exhaustion of maintaining an unshakable facade becomes unbearable. And in these moments, whether in quiet despair or in the wake of a profound personal failure, the narcissist may finally be forced to confront the truth that he is not and never was self-sufficient. This realization is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means dismantling the very identity he has spent his life constructing. Liberating because it opens the door to something greater. It is in this moment of reckoning that faith can begin to take root, that the possibility of transformation emerges. But as long as the narcissist clings to his illusion, as long as he insists on his own self-sufficiency, he remains trapped in a prison of his own making, a prison whose walls grow taller the longer he refuses to look beyond them. Beneath the grandiosity, the confidence, and the apparent self-assurance of a narcissist lies a hidden world of suffering. It is suffering that is rarely acknowledged even by the narcissist himself, because to do so would threaten the entire foundation of his carefully constructed identity. He presents himself as superior, unshakable, in control, but this persona is not a reflection of true strength. It is a shield, a necessary defense against the deep wounds he cannot afford to confront. These wounds often originate early in life, though their exact nature can vary. For some, they stem from neglect, a lack of real emotional connection during their formative years. For others, they arise from an environment where love was conditional, where worth was tied entirely to achievement, status, or obedience. In some cases, the narcissist may have been excessively praised, but in a way that was impersonal, detached from his true self. He was admired for what he did, not for who he was. He learned that love was something to be earned, something dependent on performance. And so over time, he internalized a dangerous belief that his value as a person depended entirely on maintaining a flawless image. This creates an unbearable contradiction. On the surface, the narcissist must appear whole, but deep inside, he is anything but. He is plagued by insecurity, by an ever-present fear that he is not enough, that if people saw his true self, they would reject him. And so he suppresses these doubts, burying them beneath arrogance, dominance, and a relentless pursuit of validation. The narcissist must be admired, not just because he enjoys it, but because he needs it. Validation becomes his lifeline, the only thing standing between him and the terrifying possibility of self-doubt. But no amount of external validation can ever truly silence the inner suffering. No matter how much praise he receives, it is never enough. No matter how much success he achieves, it does not bring him peace. He may surround himself with admirers, with people who reinforce his self-image, but deep down, he knows that these relationships are conditional. He is not loved for who he is. He is loved for the role he plays, for the image he projects. And so, even in the presence of others, he often feels alone. This loneliness is one of the great paradoxes of narcissism. The narcissist is constantly seeking attention, yet he remains emotionally isolated. He craves deep connection, yet he cannot allow himself to be vulnerable. He yearns for love, but he fears it just as much because love requires authenticity, and authenticity threatens to expose the very flaws he is desperate to hide. He may be surrounded by people, but he remains unknown, even to himself. The suffering intensifies over time. Maintaining the illusion of perfection is exhausting. The narcissist must constantly be on guard, ensuring that no cracks appear in his facade. Every interaction is a performance, every relationship a negotiation of power. He cannot afford to be wrong. He cannot afford to be weak. And yet, despite his best efforts, reality has a way of breaking through. A failure, a betrayal, an unexpected moment of vulnerability, any of these can trigger a crisis, forcing the narcissist to confront the very feelings he has spent a lifetime suppressing. When this happens, his response is often one of anger, denial, or withdrawal. He lashes out at others, blaming them for his pain, or he retreats further into his own world, building even higher walls around his heart. He may double down on his need for control, seeking to reassert his dominance in whatever way he can. But no matter how much he resists, the truth remains. The suffering is real, and it will not disappear simply because he refuses to acknowledge it. What makes this suffering so profound is that it is self-inflicted, yet inescapable. The narcissist's own defenses, the very mechanisms he created to protect himself, have become his prison. His pride prevents him from seeking help. His arrogance keeps him from admitting weakness. His need for admiration ensures that he never experiences the kind of genuine connection that could actually bring him peace. And so the cycle continues, with each attempt to avoid suffering only deepening it further. This is the tragedy of the narcissistic heart. It is not truly cold or unfeeling. It is not incapable of love. It is simply locked away, hidden beneath layers of fear, insecurity, and pride. The narcissist does not lack emotions. He is overwhelmed by them. But he has never learned how to process them, how to sit with them, how to embrace the truth of his own humanity. And so rather than confront his pain, he buries it deeper, convincing himself that he does not need healing, that he is fine just as he is. But suffering has a way of demanding to be seen. It does not remain silent forever. And the longer it is ignored, the louder it becomes, manifesting in anger, depression, emptiness. The narcissist may believe that he is in control, that he has mastered his emotions, but in reality, they are controlling him. They dictate his every action, his every relationship, his very perception of himself in the world. And until he is willing to face this reality, until he is willing to acknowledge the suffering beneath the mask, he will remain trapped within it. Faith, when properly understood, is not a passive belief or a blind adherence to tradition. It is a force, an active transformative force that has the power to break through the most fortified walls of the human soul. For the narcissist, whose identity is built upon pride, control, and self-sufficiency, faith is not just a challenge. It is a direct confrontation with everything he believes about himself. It demands humility, vulnerability, and surrender. 3 things the narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. And yet, it is precisely these things that hold the key to his healing. The narcissist's greatest illusion is that he is in control. He believes that his worth is something he must manufacture, that his value is something he must prove, and that his destiny is something he alone must dictate. He constructs an image of himself, powerful, intelligent, successful, and he clings to it desperately, fearing that if he lets go, there will be nothing left. But faith speaks a different truth. Faith says that worth is not earned, that value is not dependent on achievement, and that identity is not something a person creates for himself, but something given to him by God. This is an idea that the narcissist resists. He does not want to believe that he needs something beyond himself. He does not want to accept that he is, in fact, limited, that his strength has boundaries, that his wisdom is incomplete. To acknowledge these things would be to admit weakness, and weakness is intolerable to the narcissistic mind. But faith is relentless. It does not allow for self-deception. It demands honesty. It strips away illusion and forces a man to see himself as he truly is, and as he wishes to be. Not as he projects himself to be, but as he actually is in the eyes of God. For many, this moment of reckoning comes in the form of crisis. A personal failure, a deep betrayal, a sudden loss, something that shakes the very foundation of the narcissist's carefully constructed world. In these moments, the illusion of control begins to crumble. The strategies that once worked, manipulation, domination, avoidance, no longer produce the desired results. The pain that has been buried for years begins to surface. And for the first time, the narcissist is forced to confront a terrifying question. What if I am not enough? What if my strength is not sufficient? What if, despite everything I have built, I am still empty inside? This is where faith begins to work. Not in the moments of triumph, but in the moments of collapse. When all else fails, when the narcissist reaches the end of himself, when he has exhausted every possible means of maintaining his grandiose self-image, he is left with only 2 choices: despair or surrender. Despair leads to deeper bitterness, deeper isolation, deeper suffering. But surrender, true surrender, opens the door to transformation. To surrender in faith is not to give up as the narcissist might fear. It is not to become weak or insignificant. It is to acknowledge that true strength comes not from self-exaltation, but from alignment with a power greater than oneself. It is to realize that self-sufficiency was never the goal, that independence was never the ideal, that the human heart was designed to exist in relationship with others, and most importantly, with God. When a man submits to faith, he is no longer bound by the exhausting task of proving himself. He no longer has to strive for validation because he understands that his worth is already established in the eyes of his Creator. He no longer has to manipulate others into admiration because he is no longer dependent on their approval for his sense of identity. He no longer has to live in fear of failure because failure is no longer a reflection of his worth, but rather a tool for growth, a step in the process of refinement. Faith also transforms the way the narcissist views relationships. Where he once saw people as tools, as mirrors reflecting back his own greatness, he begins to see them as fellow souls, equal, flawed, yet deeply valuable. He no longer needs to dominate, to control, to prove superiority, because he understands that every person is created in the image of God, and that true greatness is not found in self-exaltation but in service. This shift does not happen overnight. The process of breaking down the narcissistic self-image is painful. It requires confrontation with long-buried fears, with deep-seated wounds, with the uncomfortable truth of one's own limitation. But faith provides the strength to endure this process. It offers the assurance that even in brokenness there is redemption. Even in weakness there is grace. Even in surrender there is victory. The narcissist who embraces faith does not become insignificant. He does not lose himself. Instead, he discovers his true self, the version of himself he has spent years manufacturing, but the self that was created by God, the self that was meant to reflect something far greater than his own ego. And in this realization, he finds something he has been searching for his entire life: peace. Certainly, here's an expansion of Keynote No, 4 in Jordan Peterson style, around 700 words, without a conclusion or headings. God's grace penetrates where psychological insight alone cannot reach. It's important to understand the limits of human knowledge. Modern psychology has made extraordinary strides in understanding human behavior, pathology, and development. We can identify patterns of dysfunction. We can trace the roots of trauma back through a person's history. We can dissect and label complex personality structures, providing frameworks that explain why people act as they do. We can offer techniques: cognitive restructuring, emotional regulation, behavioral modification, that can provide relief from suffering. But as powerful as these tools are, there are regions of the human soul that they cannot access. There are wounds so deep, places so dark, that no amount of insight or intellectual understanding can illuminate them. This is especially true in the case of the narcissist. The narcissistic structure is an elaborate defense system, one designed to keep the truth out. And even if you, as a clinician, as a friend, or even as the narcissist themselves, come to intellectually understand the origins of that structure, it doesn't automatically dissolve. Knowing why the fortress was built doesn't bring it down. Insight is not enough. The narcissist can tell you about their childhood wounds, their unmet needs, their longing for affirmation. They can recount the betrayals that led them to seal themselves off from others. But all too often, this knowledge remains trapped in the realm of the intellect. It doesn't descend into the heart, into the place where transformation happens. Because the problem isn't merely cognitive, it's existential, it's spiritual. It has to do with the nature of sin, with pride, with alienation, not only from others, but from God. The narcissist has placed themselves at the center of their own universe. They have become their own highest authority. They have become their own God. And that position is not just a psychological adaptation. It's a spiritual rebellion. It's a rejection of their fundamental dependency on something greater than themselves. And until that spiritual reality is addressed, no amount of psychological work can bring about true healing. That's where grace comes in. Grace is not something we earn. It's not something we achieve through effort or intellect or even moral striving. Grace is a gift. It's a form of divine intervention. It's the action of God reaching down into the depths of human brokenness and offering redemption, not because we deserve it, but because we need it. And this is a hard truth for the narcissist to accept. They've spent their entire lives trying to earn love, trying to prove their worth, trying to manufacture a sense of value through achievement, image, or control. The idea that their salvation might come as an unearned gift is profoundly unsettling. It undermines the entire structure they've built. But it's the only way. Because there are parts of the self that cannot be healed through effort alone. There are dimensions of the human soul that require the touch of the divine. Grace reaches into those places where words fail, where explanations collapse, where insight is powerless. Grace offers forgiveness where guilt has hardened into shame. It offers mercy where judgment has been internalized into self-contempt. It offers love that is not contingent on performance, but rooted in the unchanging character of God. And grace is not just a feeling. It's not merely a sense of being accepted or loved. It's a transformative power. It reorients the soul. It breaks the tyranny of the false self and calls forth the true self, the self that was created for relationship, for love, for communion with God and others. The narcissist doesn't need more self-esteem. They don't need more validation of their ego. What they need is to die to the false self so that they can be reborn as someone capable of receiving and giving love freely. That's what grace accomplishes. And grace operates on its own terms. It's not subject to human control or manipulation. It can't be forced or demanded. It's a mystery, an act of divine will. But it often comes in moments of surrender, in moments of brokenness, when the defenses have finally failed and the person is left with nothing but their own emptiness. In that emptiness, grace can enter. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, the love of God can penetrate where no human insight or effort ever could. This is why the spiritual dimension is essential in the healing of the narcissistic heart. Without grace, the fortress remains intact. Without grace, the false self continues to dominate. Psychological insight can reveal the architecture of the prison, but it cannot unlock the door. It cannot free the captive. Only grace can do that. Grace calls the person out of isolation and back into relationship with God, with others, with themselves as they truly are, not as they pretend to be. Grace tells the narcissist they are loved, not because they are impressive, but because they are human, because they are a child of God, because they are valuable beyond measure, even in their weakness and their failure. Certainly, here is an expansion of keynote number 5 in JordanPeterson style, around 700 words without a conclusion or headings. Genuine repentance transforms pride into humility and shame into gratitude. Now, repentance is a word we don't like to talk about much anymore. It sounds archaic. It sounds moralistic. It suggests guilt, judgment, a kind of moral reckoning that modern sensibilities often find uncomfortable. But that discomfort doesn't make the concept any less vital. Repentance is not about self-condemnation. It's not about wallowing in guilt. It's about the reorientation of the entire being toward what is true and good and holy. It is the voluntary act of turning away from the lie and stepping toward the truth. And for the narcissist, this act is nothing short of revolutionary. At the core of narcissism lies pride. Not the healthy pride that comes from competence or responsibility, but the corrupted pride that insists on self-sufficiency, superiority, and control. It's a pride that refuses to acknowledge limitation. It's the voice that says, I am enough in myself. I need nothing. I owe nothing. I answer to no one. That pride is a wall that separates the narcissist from the world. It protects the carefully curated image they present to others and to themselves. But it also isolates them from the love, connection, and grace they desperately need. Pride imprisons the soul. Repentance smashes through that wall. It requires the admission that the life built on pride is a false life, that the persona presented to the world is a mask, that underneath the grandiosity there is deep need for forgiveness, need for healing, need for God. Repentance is the conscious decision to put down the weapons of arrogance and deceit and to stand exposed before the truth. It is to say, I have been wrong. I have sought the wrong things. I have made myself the center of everything, and in doing so, I have become lost. And that admission is devastating. It's humiliating, but it's also liberating. Humility isn't self-hatred. It's not humiliation for its own sake. It's the accurate appraisal of one's place in the order of being. It's knowing that you are not God, that you are not the highest authority, that there is something above you to which you owe allegiance. Humility doesn't mean thinking less of yourself. It means thinking of yourself less. It means being oriented outward instead of inward. It means recognizing the sovereignty of truth, of goodness, of God over your own will and desires. When pride is broken and replaced by humility, something extraordinary happens. The shame that has been lurking in the background of the narcissistic psyche, often denied, often repressed, comes into the light. Shame says, I am not worthy. I am not lovable. I am broken. And it's a painful thing to confront. But in repentance, shame no longer serves as a weapon against the self. It becomes something different. It becomes a catalyst for gratitude. Because in repentance, when a person stands humbled and ashamed and discovers that God does not turn away from them, but instead moves toward them with mercy, everything changes. To know you are seen in your worst moments, in your darkest depths, and still loved, that is the beginning of gratitude. Gratitude emerges when you realize that what you have been given, grace, forgiveness, love, is something you could never earn, something you could never deserve. And yet it's offered freely. The narcissist is used to living in a world of transactions. If they give, they expect something in return. If they receive, they feel they must have earned it. Everything is about control, about maintaining a balance of power. But gratitude destroys that equation. Gratitude acknowledges the gift, the unearned favor, and it creates a sense of obligation, not in the sense of repayment, which is impossible, but in the sense of responsibility, a responsibility to live differently, to live in alignment with the truth that has been revealed, to act in accordance with the mercy that has been shown. Gratitude turns shame into a recognition of need that has been met by love. It transforms the internal dialogue from "I am worthless" to "I have been redeemed." It's a posture of the heart that continually remembers the gift of grace and responds, not with entitlement, but with humility and joy. Repentance initiates this transformation. It is the first act of turning from pride and shame toward humility and gratitude. And this process is not a one-time event, it's a way of life. The narcissistic tendencies don't vanish overnight. The pull toward self-sufficiency, toward pride, remains strong. But repentance becomes a practice, a daily turning away from the lie of autonomy and a daily turning toward the truth of dependence on God. And with each act of repentance, humility deepens, gratitude grows. The narcissistic heart, once hardened and closed, begins to soften. It opens. It becomes capable of love, capable of receiving and giving, not out of need for validation, but out of genuine connection and grace. Certainly, here is an expansion of Keynote No. 6 in Jordan Peterson style, around 700 words without a conclusion or headings. The journey from narcissistic isolation to communion with God and others is the return to authentic being. It's a process marked by struggle, resistance, and ultimately redemption. Narcissism is a state of profound isolation, even if it's masked by charisma, achievement, or superficial relationships. At its core, the narcissistic individual is cut off from the world, and more importantly, from the transcendent source of meaning and connection, God Himself. They are trapped in the confines of their own self-created identity, enslaved by an image they feel compelled to protect at all costs. The persona becomes a prison, and the more effort that is expended in maintaining that facade, the more distant they become from any genuine relationship or connection that could offer them true life. In that state of isolation, the world is reduced to a stage upon which the narcissist must constantly perform. Every interaction is a transaction. Every relationship is utilitarian. People become mirrors, their worth measured by how well they reflect back the grandiosity the narcissist is desperate to see. But this is a hollow life. There's no substance to it, it's exhausting. And beneath the surface lies a deep well of fear, fear of being found out, fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment. The narcissist is not free. They are enslaved by their need to be seen as more than they truly are. And this enslavement drives them further away from authentic being. Authentic being is only found in relationship. Not the manipulative relationships that serve as tools for validation, but genuine communion. Communion is fundamentally spiritual in nature. It begins with God. To be in communion with God is to stand in truth. It's to acknowledge that you are not the author of your own existence. You are not sovereign over life. You are a created being, dependent, limited, and yet beloved. In the presence of God, there is no need for pretense. He sees through every mask, every defense mechanism, every carefully constructed narrative, and yet He does not turn away. He invites, He calls, and to respond to that call is the first step toward freedom. The narcissist's return to authentic being requires this encounter. It requires them to face the terrifying reality that their identity is not self-created, but God-given. They must relinquish their claim to be their own creator, their own judge, their own God. And this is a death of sorts. It's the death of the false self, the ego that has dominated their life for so long. But only through that death can there be rebirth. Only through surrender can there be restoration. In communion with God, the narcissist begins to understand who they truly are. Not as a construct, not as an image to be controlled, but as a person, a soul, created in love and for love. They are no longer required to maintain the exhausting charade of perfection or superiority. They can stand in humility, recognizing their limitations without shame, because those limitations are held within the infinite grace of God. And that changes everything. In that space of grace, the narcissist can begin to relate to others differently. No longer as objects to manipulate, but as fellow beings with intrinsic value. The journey toward communion with others is built on this foundation. When you know you are loved by God, not because of your accomplishments or your image, but because of who you are in your essence, you become capable of loving others in the same way. The defensiveness begins to fade. The need to dominate or control relationships loosens its grip. Vulnerability becomes possible. And in vulnerability, real intimacy can take root. Relationships cease to be battlegrounds for validation and instead become places of mutual support, understanding, and grace. This is not an easy process. The habits of narcissistic isolation run deep. The pull toward self-centeredness doesn't disappear. But the difference is that now there is a choice. The narcissist who has tasted communion with God knows there is another way. They have experienced a different kind of life, one grounded in truth and love rather than fear and pride. And that knowledge compels them to keep moving forward, to keep choosing communion over isolation. The return to authentic being is a continuous act. It requires vigilance, humility, and courage. It involves a daily reckoning with the temptation to retreat into old patterns of self-aggrandizement and control. But each time the choice is made to move toward God and others in truth, the soul becomes more alive, more real. The layers of falsehood are stripped away, and what remains is something solid, something genuine. A person capable of love, capable of being loved, and capable of participating fully in the web of relationships that define a meaningful life. The journey out of narcissistic isolation is the journey back to who we were created to be, beings made for communion, for love, for truth, and for authentic existence in the presence of God and one another.